Kan vi skrue lidt op? Tak. Fem. Apparently not. Is it better now? 1, 2, 3, test. Is it better now? Lovely. Okay, then now I can say welcome to the launch of the Danish Foreign Policy Review 2025. Greetings to everyone streaming online. My name is Jessica Larsen. I'm a senior researcher and co-editor of the yearbook. I will be introducing and chairing today's event. The Danish Foreign Policy Review, DFPR, is a yearly publication which covers topical and central events that are relevant to Danish foreign security and development policy. The DFPR stands out among yearbooks on foreign policy due to its distinct Danish and Nordic angle. In that sense, it's an important contribution not only to academic research on foreign affairs, but also to policymakers, to embassies that I know are represented here today, to students, to the general public, and to journalists. Historically, the yearbook is DIS's most downloaded publication, and as a co-editor, I'm of course not surprised. The yearbook deals with topics that affect us all. In these times, it seems that every day we're writing history, and most of the time not in a good way. Pressure and conflicts in the foreign and security policy landscape are mounting by the day, and it's a cliche to say that we live in turbulent times. Just yesterday, I pulled out the Danish Foreign and Security Policy Strategy from 2023 just to make sure that I got one thing right. Because when the strategy was published, myself and colleagues were wondering what role the Middle East played in the strategy. Do you know how many times the Middle East is mentioned in the strategy? Once. One time, and that is in conjunction with European and Danish security, in other words, looking at the Middle East from a terrorist perspective. So, yes, we live in turbulent times, and it is a cliche to say it, but this only increases the need to map, to analyze, and to reflect on the evolving situation and the implications for, not least, Danish foreign policy, because Denmark is a small state with an open economy, and Denmark likes best when the world is stable and predictable and when the world is governed by multilateralism and international law. And this is what gives the Danish Foreign Policy Review purpose and value. The editorial team consists of myself, along with senior researcher and head of unit, Cecilie Felicia Stockholm Banke, who is standing at the back of the room, and senior researcher here at DIS, Mikkel Runge Olesen, sitting in front. I will get back to him in a moment. We have had assistance from Olivia Garde Flensburg, who's also sitting at the back. And we have had a firm steer from the communications department, not least Jette Maribo, who's not here today. So thank you to all involved. Thank you to the contributors. And thank you also to the events section making this launch possible today. So what is in it? What is in the yearbook? Well, each volume consists of an article by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defense, and then a handful of academic peer-reviewed articles on topics depending on the world around us. To discuss this year's volume and get deeper into what's cooking in foreign policy, we have assembled an excellent panel of speakers. First, we will hear from Mikkel Runge Olesen, who is senior researcher and, as I say, co-editor of the yearbook. Mikkel will be speaking about the year in Danish foreign and security policy. Next, we have Marlene Wind, who's professor at Copenhagen University, who has contributed an article to this year's volume. And Marlene will be speaking about the transformation in Danish EU skepticism. And last but not least, we have Rasmus Brun Pedersen from Aarhus University, who also contributed this year and will speak about change and continuity in the Danish foreign policy tradition. Now, before I give the floor to Mikkel, I would like to say that after the panel, we would like to invite you to join us for bubbles and snacks to celebrate the launch of the yearbook. So please, we'd be very happy if you would stay after the seminar here. And also, if you haven't already, feel free to grab a free hard copy of the yearbook. They're lying outside. And also keep in mind that we have an online version on dis.dk. So if you know of any readers that would be interested in reading the yearbook, please do share the link or a hard copy as well. So those were my words. I look forward to today. And Mikkel, please, now the floor is yours.
Thank you for that, Jessica. Is the sound okay? Excellent. Okay. I'll just jump right to it. The year of 2024 in Danish foreign and security policy. Well, the thing about being a yearbook is that we want to, the volume that comes out in 2025 wants to give special attention to the year that has passed, the year 2024. We have, as Jessica said, we have two essays, we have two articles from Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lars Rasmussen, and the Danish Minister of Defense, Troels Lund Poulsen. And since the ministers, they get to write every single year, we are quite strict in asking them to stick to the year that we ask them to. So their essays are about 2024. Now, the authors of the academic articles, they don't get to write an article every year, so we're a bit more open with them. They will be able to cover a bit broader. But I figured, as a co-editor, I might as well apply the same medicine to myself. I will now try to stick to the year 2024. It feels like a long time ago already. I will try to talk a little bit about the two articles from the ministers. I will not present the two articles, the two essays from the ministers here today. I encourage you to read them, but I will make references to them from time to time. And as I said, I will try to stick to 2024. Now, I will also cheat a little bit. I will pick three themes that were important back in the ancient times of 2024, and then I will spend a little bit of time of saying, well, so what? What about now that Trump is here, 2025? So bear with me with that. Good. Theme number one, Ukraine. Okay, so I'll start with a quote from the yearbook. And this is from Foreign Minister Lars Rasmussen. Despite these developments, Ukraine's illegal, unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine remained the biggest threat to European and transatlantic security for the third year in a row. And it was indeed. 2024 was very much about Ukraine. Aid for Ukraine has been a defining feature for Danish foreign and security policy since 2022. There are many reasons for this, and it includes broad support in the Danish parliament and public, strong support and encouragement from the Biden administration. This was something that the US also wanted Europe to do. This is something that we even got credit for doing this from the Biden administration. Remember those days, the Americans used to like that we supported Ukraine, and we even got to count it as part of military expenditures in NATO. So what was not to like? It was very, very strong, and we of course also have the third factor, to contain Russia and limit its potential to threaten other parts of Europe. And then we couldn't mention a fourth, a certain amount of, but it's tied to this one, a certain amount of small state sympathy with a relatively small country. Of course, Ukraine is not small, but compared to Russia it is, being attacked by a big neighbor. So, for these reasons, all these things point in the same direction. Therefore, Denmark has been a front runner really in supporting Ukraine, especially when it comes to military aid. Now, of course, then 2025 happened. Donald Trump came to power. A lot is different. We do not get quite the same amount of credit with the U.S. For supporting Ukraine. You might even say that the division between the U.S. and Europe over Ukraine is one of the largest, areas of division between the U.S. and Europe. So under Biden, it was actually something that helped tie us together with the U.S. Today, not so much. So theme number 1, a lot has changed. Theme number 2, Arctic security. We'll start with a quote this time, also from Foreign Minister Lars Rasmussen in the yearbook. The Arctic is also affected by increasing geopolitical competition and tension. Russia seeks to demonstrate its power through military buildup and aggressive and threatening behavior in the Arctic. At the same time, we must be clear-eyed when it comes to China's long-term strategic interests in the Arctic. And this theme is also it was very important in 2024. It had been gaining importance over time, at least for a decade, if not more, due to heightened geopolitical tensions in the region. Now, you could argue that 3 factors have been driving this development. First, the fallout from the Ukraine crisis spilling over into the Arctic, and we can sort of talk about Ukraine Part 1 and Part 2. We have the 2014 annexation of Crimea, which led to sanctions on especially Russian oil and gas extraction in the Arctic, and then along with it a long line of other sanctions, I should mention. And then we have the 2022 invasion, of course, which was broader in scope in terms of how much it affected the Arctic, in that even the Arctic Council itself, the Arctic Council, usually regarded as this example of how it's possible to cooperate in the Arctic, could no longer be shielded from the conflict between Russia and the West. Then we have sort of a gradual increased Chinese and Russian activity in the Arctic. I could spend time on saying that the Chinese and the Russians are not the same thing in the Arctic. The Russians are a much bigger player than the Chinese, and their interest is much more persistent. I will only say that Russian and Chinese interests, sort of taken overall, was an important factor for the heightened geopolitical tensions. And then, of course, we have U.S. reactions to Russian and Chinese moves in the Arctic that sort of led us to a point where I would argue that we used to talk about this thing called Arctic exceptionalism, this thing about the Arctic being a particularly peaceful area in the world, where countries that may not always be able to see eye to eye other places in the world could come together and cooperate, and that state of affairs, one can argue exactly when it ended. It arguably happened in phases, but after 2022, I think we must get to the point where this idea of Arctic exceptionalism, it may come back, but at the moment it's not that much there. Now, of course, that was 2024. All these things were important in 2024. Well, the Arctic is still important. It just, from a Danish perspective, it shifted a little bit. And of course, here I'm referring to, and I can actually, with good conscience, cover this a little bit more, because the Greenland crisis actually started in 2024. It was the 23rd of December 2024 that Donald Trump announced his intention of trying to acquire Greenland for the second time. And of course that has changed for Denmark and for Greenland, what's at stake in the Arctic, where the US is no longer just the big power ally where we need to keep on the good side of. It's still that, but it's also this question of, is the US actually a threat now to the integrity of the kingdom? So again, theme number 2, Arctic security. A lot has changed these last half year. Theme number 3, Nordic security and Sweden in NATO. And this time it's the Defense Minister Troels Poulsen in his essay in the journal. Nordic defense cooperation with our Nordic allies has never been stronger. It's a strong priority for Denmark to continue to strengthen the Nordic cooperation even further. Nordic defense cooperation has certainly intensified drastically in 2024 and the years leading up to it. It has to do with three main factors. And perhaps I should mention Nordic defense cooperation is not exactly a new idea. It's an idea that actually has come up for the last 175 years from time to time, and it's just never really worked that well. And one of the reasons that the ambitions for Nordic defense cooperation were seldomly fully realized was because the Nordic countries simply did not share threat perception, and that's the first point I want to highlight here. That what changed, not just in 2024, but gradually also in the years leading up to it, was that the Nordic countries are increasingly beginning to share the same threat perception when it comes to Russia as the key challenge to the region. That makes it a lot easier to cooperate. Back in time, the Nordic countries would first have a hard time agreeing who the enemy was. Was it Germany? Was it Russia? And then what to do about it, whether to be a hawk, whether to play tough with Russia, or to try to promote a more diplomatic approach. But more and more in recent years, the Nordic countries have come to see Russia in the same light, and that makes it easier to cooperate. Secondly, a focus on Russia makes the Baltic Sea a much more relevant theater of operations for the Nordics and make them more important partners for each other. And this simply has to do with geography. If the Baltic Sea area becomes a theater of potential operations, then the countries that are close by become more interesting in terms of cooperation. So that also plays a factor, that it simply makes more sense to cooperate with the Swedes now because we're talking about our own near abroad. We're not talking about halfway around the globe anymore. So that also has had the effect of making Nordic cooperation much more viable and attractive. And then, of course, we have a very 2024 point, and that is in 2024, Sweden joined NATO, a year after Finland. And that meant that for the first time, all 5 Nordic countries are now part of NATO. And that is actually quite a big deal when it comes to Nordic defense cooperation, because historically the problem has been that whenever cooperation between the Nordic countries reached a certain level, it became irrelevant, because then the NATO members would say, well, if we're in a real crisis, we can't handle it with you guys. We have to call Washington, or we have to call Brussels, or something like that. And then this idea of a Nordic solution for anything sort of ran out into the sand. So all the Nordic countries being members of NATO, which happened, was finalized in 2024, that removed the single biggest obstacle to Nordic defense and security cooperation. And therefore, it is worthwhile to sort of ask the question if there has ever been a better time to cooperate amongst the Nordic countries than now. And I cheated a little bit with this picture, because this picture is not from 2024, it's from 2025, with an updating from May 2025 with the Nordic defense ministers updating the NORDEFCO founding document. Now, of all the 3 themes that I've covered here today, this one has probably been least destabilized by the coming of Donald Trump. Of course, Donald Trump and his the uncertainty about NATO, not least, has destabilized the entire background for cooperation, but it has also, in a sense, made cooperation even more attractive, because in a situation where we don't know whether we can actually count on the Americans, even small allies that you can count on become much more attractive. So in that sense, of the three themes, I would argue that Nordic security and Sweden and NATO and this drive towards more Nordic defense and security cooperation, that has actually arguably probably been the least destabilized by the Trump administration. Okay, I will stop here and I move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, Marlene pours herself some water. Thank you very much for this overview of a very eventful year. No less complicated is the Danish relationship to the EU, which is what Marlene will be speaking about.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you for inviting me to speak today and also inviting me to be part of this amazing book. I must admit that when I said yes to join, not today, but to længere væk. Yeah. Okay. You hear me? Good. So I thought it would be a walk in the park and easy, but of course it was a bit more than that. I'm going to give you maybe a little bit of an alternative view of Danish EU skepticism, because what we are all wondering right now this year is, of course, whether the turn that Denmark has made to become more pro-European, where does it come from, and also how deep is this transformation. And the piece that I have written is actually also a result of many meetings with ambassadors here in Copenhagen over the past year, but also years going before that, where a lot of the ambassadors keep asking me, what on earth is going on with you Danes? We don't understand you. Why can you be so incredibly nice and, human rights oriented and international, and then so anti-European? Where does it come from? I found out that there's actually very little written about this, because if you ask the lawyers, they almost don't write about this topic. If you ask the political scientists, they only stick to the politics. If you ask the historians, they also mainly stick to historical facts and anecdotes. And what I'm going to try to do today, and also in my chapter, is to build a bridge from Danish constitutional history to the EU skepticism. Of course, it's not coming out of the blue. I'm currently writing a book on Oxford University Press on this. So this is maybe a condensed version that also reflects that I've spent the past 15 years also as a professor in the law department. So what I argue is that when we dig we need to dig much deeper into Danish constitutional history to really understand why on earth Denmark ended up with all its exemptions and all its, you don't see an EU flag in Denmark. You haven't, for the 30 years I've been in this business. It's only now that I sometimes may be spotting a flag. And it's really strange to a lot of people coming from other European countries that we have had so many problems embracing the European project. So the point I'm trying to make, and the address that I'm trying to do both today but also in the chapter is, of course, whether the transformation we have seen the past year, where all of a sudden Mette Frederiksen, our Prime Minister, does no longer say that the EU is gagak. I don't know what it's called in English, but absurd maybe. But is now completely embracing the European project, at least in her talk before the summer break in the Parliament. I mean, I really had to squeeze my arm to understand whether this is really true, but also how far does it really go. So that's what my chapter is about, and how far does this transformation go when it comes to Danish EU policy. And what I argue is, of course, that for Denmark, the EU has first and foremost been a market project. We did not join because de Gaulle did not want the UK, and the UK was Denmark's primary market, so we waited until the Brits wanted to join, but it doesn't change, and of course the Irish, but it doesn't change the fact that we really joined because we wanted to sell our bacon. There was no feelings, there was no idealism, it was never there. And of course you can disagree with me. This is my take on it. So for us, this was the big EU being really dangerous and threatening in many ways to our sovereignty. Right. So I spent quite a lot of time in the chapter to define this issue of sovereignty. Now I try to change the slide, but it does not seem to want to change. No? Can someone help me? Because I don't have that much time, you know. I'm in a hurry. Is there a... No? Can I put that?
Yeah, let's see if it's working.
Jeg kan tage noget mere vand imens. Næste. Ja. Thank you so much. Skal jeg bruge den der? Ja. Se, det gør jeg. So what am I arguing? I'm arguing that we actually have to go back to the way Denmark transformed, or I would maybe rather say did not transform after the Second World War. So where the rest of Europe and the EU reformed its political systems to become constitutional democracies, Denmark and the UK, but also to some degree Sweden, but they were not part of the EU, so it's not so important right now. But Denmark, like the UK, we stayed a majoritarian democracy. What does that mean? It means that we are obsessed with our sovereignty, and we are obsessed with the idea of having no one over or above the Danish parliament. The rest of Europe, of course, due to Nazism and the war, they were by the Americans actually forced to change their constitutions and to introduce a kind of balanced democracy that became the norm in all of the world, all of the Western world, in light of the Second World War and in many decades after. But this small little region in the north and the UK simply did not buy into that transformation of constitutional democracy, checks and balances. We stayed majoritarian, and I think that has a lot to do with our approach to Europe, because what the EU also represented was, of course, a constitutional democracy with a strong court and with constrained parliaments, with constrained politics in general. And that was very, very difficult for Denmark. It's not something we have talked very much about, but a lot of the kind of anti-EU approach in Denmark over the years has really been about the same as in the UK, that we did not like anyone from the outside to come and tell us what to do, and we certainly did not like that what our parliament had decided could be set aside by a so-called foreign court. And the EU is simply based on the same image of constitutional democracy that we have seen emerge in the rest of the European Union. Every new country that comes into the EU has to be a constitutional democracy with constrained parliaments, but this was not something we liked in the Nordics. So all the debate about the courts and the conventions we also see right now in Denmark, I think can be reduced to this issue of our conception of democracy. Of course, it's also very similar to the big debate in the UK for years and years and years that they didn't like to have a European law above British law in their parliaments. So I think that explains quite a lot of the Danish situation here. And it also is very clear from the Danish amendment to the treaty, where everyone else, in light of the Holocaust and the Second World War, amended their constitutions, and when they joined the EU, they had new constitutions. Denmark did not do that, and we actually added a paragraph in our amendment in 53. Due to the EU development of the community, Denmark was not part at that time, but Mark Sørensen, who was active, a lawyer, made a suggestion to the politicians that we should change the Danish constitution slightly so that we could maybe engage ourselves in supranational cooperation at some point. But the way Denmark amended its constitution was very, very limited, and I would say also quite problematic, because what it says is that we can give away sovereignty to a certain degree, but that indicated that when we give something away, we lose it. So the way Denmark has engaged with the European Union has constantly been this zero-sum. If something is going to Brussels, it's taken from us in Copenhagen. So, in my opinion, at least, and the study I have done, I've been in the archives of the debate in Denmark from 45 until 55. It's quite interesting for a political scientist to go into the archives, but also very interesting. It's very puzzling to me that there was not in the Danish parliament or in the academic debate at the time any reflections about what happened in the rest of Europe on how to contain the parliament and how to balance the parliament and how parliaments can sometimes be dangerous. That's what we saw during the Weimar Republic, right? And that's why the results or the consequences were taken in Germany and many other European countries. There was no debate about that. We kept believing in politics and politicians in Scandinavia and in Denmark in particular. So in Denmark, the debate continued. We were told when we had all the referendums that were needed in accordance with the Danish constitution that we did not change in that respect, that we were constantly told that we did join in 72 by a nice margin, but we were told again and again that the union is stone dead, and every time we had a referendum, we were constantly told by the politicians that there was no consequences of those choices that we signed up to. So that is also a very, I cannot go into all the details in the chapter. I have many more details also about the Constitutional Court in Denmark or Supreme Court in Denmark. We don't have a Constitutional Court, and how that accepted a case from the ordinary citizens challenging the Danish government signing up to the Maastricht Treaty. So Denmark became famous for its skepticism. And in 92, of course, we became, that was the big year where we both won in football. If you cannot join them, you have to beat them, was the saying of Uffe Ellemann-Jensen. But again, the presentation was that, the federal EU is coming to take us, and that is very, very dangerous. So constantly this kind of negative campaign in the Danish public. So we said no to the euro again in 2000. We also said no to amend the Justice and Home Affairs opt-out in 2015. But then something happened, because after the Russian invasion in Ukraine in 2022, Denmark all of a sudden dropped its defense opt-out. And that is, of course, a remarkable change in our approach to Europe. The question is, nevertheless, however, still, how fundamental is this change? And of course, this can only be speculation, but my take is that it's probably not as transformational as some might believe. There's however, no doubt that Denmark has moved closer to Europe after the invasion of Ukraine, and in particular after the American administration entering office in January 2025. So I'm finishing very soon. My argument in the article is that the reorientation is clear, but it's probably less driven by idealism or a newfound EU enthusiasm, even though it certainly was clear in Mette Frederiksen's speech in the Danish parliament, but it's much more driven by security concerns and increased vulnerability, feeling of being sort of sacrificed, also, of course, due to the threats against Greenland in the United States. So the fear of these two guys is driving Denmark into the arms of Europe. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Marlene. And now on to the next presentation on change and continuity in the Danish foreign policy tradition by Rasmus Brun Pedersen.
Can you hear me? Okay. Looks good? Yeah, all right. Yeah, thank you very much. My contribution to this yearbook, to this year's yearbook, I think is probably the least policy-oriented piece that have ever been published in the yearbook's history. That said, this is kind of primarily a kind of a theoretical exercise. But what I have tried to do in my contribution is to look into this question about when is something new, when is something continuity, and when do things change in Danish foreign policy. And this is basically driven by kind of an observation that one of the recurrent themes in Danish foreign policy is not always to talk about the actual content of a policy or a certain period or a certain decision. But we also have a tendency to kind of discuss in the Danish foreign policy whether this represents something new or whether it's a break with the tradition, meaning that we are really much obsessed in Danish foreign policy about whether or not we see continuity or we actually are able to do something new and to exercise more kind of independent foreign policies compared to what we have seen before. And just to give you kind of an illustration of this, then there has been certain focus points that we can point to. For instance, one of the recurrent themes in Danish foreign policies, for instance, the Danish policy towards Germany and the accommodation politics related to the Second World War and the First World War, and whether and how that kind of fits into the Danish foreign policy tradition. Is it something that we should embrace, or should we kind of discard it as something that is a deviant period? We've also seen it in discussions about the EU, as Marlene talked about, but we have also seen it in the discussions about NATO, whether Danish NATO membership in 1949 represented a change in Danish foreign policy, whether it was a break, or it was kind of a logic continuation of the way that we have accommodated to the great powers in our neighborhood. We have also seen it in the relations to the footnote policy in the 1980s, where there has been a discussion on whether or not this period actually fits in, or whether it was too idealistic, or whether it was something else. Basically, how does that actually fit into what we consider as a Danish foreign policy? And this is also some of the things that we have seen in relations to the Anders Fogh Rasmussen period, the participations in the various coalition wars. Did the Danish participation in Iraq with this robust military contribution, does that fit in, or was kind of this use of armed forces something that broke with kind of a more kind of traditional Danish peace-seeking tradition? We have also seen it in relations to Ukraine, whether or not the Danish engagement is something new, does it break with the tradition, etc. So kind of besides the actual content of these different debates, the substantive elements, there's always had this discussions about whether things fits in or not in Danish foreign policy. And what I do try to do in my article is to try to use this concept of foreign policy tradition in order to assess whether some of these specific decisions, but also some of the broader tendencies in Danish foreign politics, how they relate to each other, how they fit in, and how they connect to each other, by try to focus on whether these different time periods, as we can say, kind of fits into this kind of an overall Danish foreign policy traditions, and where we see breaks and where we see continuations. And some of the reasons why this is important is also that when we have these discussions, it's also basically discussions about the national identity, the Danish identity, and how we see ourselves and perceive ourselves. But it's also one way to understand kind of the type of action space that small states might have when they are creating their foreign policies. And in the article, I'm not only focusing on specific decisions, but I try to look into broader trends, where I've produced this very confusing table, where I try to look into what we can call different doctrines that have kind of dominated Danish foreign policy for the last 100 years or so. Of course, it's always debatable what is a doctrine and where should you put kind of the division lines between different periods. But in the article, I kind of identify these different doctrines that have kind of been formulated and dominated Danish foreign policies for the last 100 years. And what I'm basically trying to do here in the article is to kind of to make an analysis based on the literature on how these relate to each other, and whether we see continuations between these different doctrines, or whether we see different types of changes in it. And that also boils into not only kind of a political discussions about the relationship and what we can do and the content of these different doctrines, but it also touches upon a broader academic discussions on how we actually assess change and continuity of these contemporary foreign policy decisions. And here in the Danish literature, usually we would expect, or when we talk about change and continuity, that we try to measure things, look into the actual content of a policy and see how much it changed. Do we use different tools in different ways? Are we cooperating with different types of people, etc.? And that will also usually be kind of the logic way to do it, but a kind of a particular Danish characteristic in the academic literature is that we often take contemporary decisions, being people of things that happens today, and then we try to compare it with the past in order to see whether it's deviate or not from what has happened in the past. So, for instance, when we are talking about the militarist activism of the Rasmussen period, then we usually take this policy or these doctrines and then compare it with a certain thing in the past, thereby creating a reference point that we use for comparisons. And sometimes it fits, and then we can talk about continuations. In other times there might be differences, which means that people are talking about deviations about what happens in the present time. And what I've done in the article is that I have read a lot, some kind of a literature review of the Danish foreign policy literature, more or less of how it has treated these different doctrines and seen the connections between them over the last 100 years or so. So it's a rather big literature list. And what's the basic conclusion is that when we look into the academic literature's treatment of the relations between these different doctrines, we see different interpretations in the literature on how things are related, and that basically also means that we have different answers to how we see change and continuity, which ultimately might also be an explanation for that there has been so much confusion in the literature, because as always, academics can't agree on anything, especially not on this question about change and continuity. But what we see in the literature is that we have a realist tradition, which basically kind of emphasizes Danish adaptations to great powers, don't see much autonomy for Denmark to make decisions. And then we see different traditions that are a little bit more positive on what Denmark can do, and also the opportunities Denmark has in the international system, so that is basically not just adaptation. And that variance comes in two traditions. If we take the realist ones, then kind of a tendency amongst many realist or kind of small state scholars is basically that Denmark is just following great power politics. There's not much room for maneuvering. There's not much space for independent actions, meaning basically that what we look into the history of Danish foreign policy, the Danish foreign policy, it's kind of a long line of continuity, where different doctrines like the Scavenius adaptation to Germany, Munch, Hækkerup, and so on, they're kind of seen as something that are quite similar to each other, namely that we react to developments in the international systems, and we also accommodate to the great power pressure and the power balance around us. So this is what I've labeled this 50 shades of adaptations, meaning basically that there's a kind of a negative understanding of Danish foreign policy as a merely adaptation. The only thing that the literature really can't grasp, this literature can't grasp, is the footnote periods, which is something that is considering outside of Danish foreign policy. And for those of you who don't know about the footnote periods, it's a period in the 1980s where Denmark made different opt-outs or had different footnotes attached to various NATO documents, with the ambition to kind of formulate more idealistic versions of what Denmark should pursue in international relations. That was not an official Danish government position. It was driven by the opposition, but due to the Danish parliamentary system, the opposition parties had the power to exercise their influence or their preferences on the Danish governments. So that was something that was outside, because that was not an accommodation. That was basically a kind of a criticism of what happened in the international system. But here, kind of the general history about Danish foreign policy is basically that is a long list of continuations where we see variations as a difference in degrees, where we try to accommodate to what happens outside. Another tradition in the literature is a little bit more kind of optimistic when it comes to the different opportunities that Denmark has as a nation, where it operates both with something that is outside the tradition, but also things that are clearly inside the tradition. And this is often called the dualist perspective in Danish foreign policies, where the argument is that Danish foreign policies represent a balance between internationalistic, value-based, idealistic interests, but also kind of a realist approach. And according to these scholars that are kind of subscribing to this point of view, we have a kind of a midfield here where we have kind of the core of the tradition, which is centered around some of the things that happened during the Munch doctrine, the Ellemann, Hækkerup, and also perhaps the Frederiksen period. And then, as you can see, there are things that are not really fitting into this tradition. And these are doctrines or policies or decisions that have been either too deterministic, where we have kind of adopted too much based on certain criteria, but also examples where value-based policies were kind of too dominant and kind of not represented a balance between these different concerns. And this basically puts for Rasmussen together with Jørgensen outside of the tradition, whereas the Scavenius also outside the tradition because that was too accommodating. But that also suggests that kind of the core of the Danish foreign policy tradition represents this balance between different concerns, where, for instance, membership in the EU, as Marlene talked about, is both can be seen as a representation of more idealistic elements, but it's clearly also based on more pragmatic adaptational trends, where Denmark had to follow kind of the development in the EU in order to sort of bake or do different things. So this is kind of the midfield here. And according to this, a lot of things also when it comes to NATO membership and Danish participation in international organizations, this is kind of seen within this field because it represents a balance between different drivers in Danish foreign policy. And this has long been kind of a position that has been dominated because we have this dualist approach to Danish foreign policy. The thing, of course, is that large periods in the Danish foreign policy history over the last 100 years is kind of written out of the tradition. It's outside the tradition, something else. And we don't know really what it is, at least according to this literature. The final position, also we see in the literature, has been a much more kind of inclusive tradition, where it's not so much about kind of writing things out of the tradition, but try to find kind of a more holistic, or approach a more holistic understanding of Danish foreign policy. And this is some of the things that we've seen in the late Nikolaj Petersen's work, where different types of strategies are kind of positioned within the overall tradition. But we also see that Denmark has much more leeway. We can adapt, we can change foreign policies based on the constellation of kind of the international power balance, and also based on how many resources Denmark has. And according to Nikolaj Pedersen's work, this basically suggests that Denmark has much more autonomy to design its foreign policy, giving kind of the constraints that it will live under as a small state. But it also means that there's much more flexibility when it comes to understand what Denmark can do in the international relations. This is something similar to what I have also been working with, trying to lift my own work up, and try to say that we have different traditions in the Danish foreign policy, which kind of range on a continuum, where Jørgensen might be kind of an outlier, but still within the tradition. Then we have different groupings of different types of doctrines that represent policy responses that were rational in certain time periods, giving the constraints that Denmark lived under. So there might be a variation here, but it's all part of the same tradition. So this is very much kind of a theoretical exercise. But again, we can also ask the question: and so what? Why is meta studies of the literature interesting? One of the reasons why these things are interesting is that it kind of points us in the direction of what is the Danish national identity, what is it that we can actually expect our politicians to do, and how much leeway can we expect that we actually have under certain conditions. And here I think that basically also relates to the question about how great the Danish action space is in foreign policy. Do we always have to follow the trends? Do we always have to be kind of following great power balances, or do we actually also have possibilities to adopt more individual, more independent foreign policies? And again, depending on which version you subscribe to, there is a big variation in this view. Where I think the tendency over the last couple of years has been that what we have seen is that Denmark has kind of grown into many of these institutions, many of the things that actually happens, but have also been quite good at actually exploiting membership to its own purpose, so that we also gain and not just follow kind of great powers. So therefore, at least my reading of it in the literature, this integration in EU, integration in NATO and other organizations has become an integrated part of Danish foreign policy traditions, where most of the actions will be filtered through more multilateral relations. So therefore, Denmark has been quite good at navigating great powers, at least the friendly great powers that we have known for some years. It might change in the future, but we have been quite good at navigating. We have cultivated good relations, but we have also used this to our own purpose in order to improve status and improve Danish interests. So therefore, the good news is actually that there's not just determinism when it comes to Danish foreign policy, but we also see much more leeway in order to pursue more independent actions, of course, under certain boundaries given by the international power balance. So this is basically what my piece is about, and as I said, it's clearly the least policy-oriented piece in the volume. But thank you for the words.
Oh, yeah, it's muted. Thank you. Did you hear me? well, maybe actually to the people online. This was a window into some of the articles that you can read about or read in the yearbook. But there are other articles, and they are also worth mentioning. The first is Professor Sten Rynning from the University of Southern Denmark, who has written an article about NATO and the breakdown of the transatlantic relationship and how Denmark needs to reconsider its security. And then the other article that you can also read is a comparative study written by Professor Mette Kjær from the University of Aarhus, and I have to read to make sure I get it right here, Managing Director at the Expert Group for Aid Studies, Jan Petersson, and Senior Researcher at Michelsen Institute Elling Tjønnelund. They make a comparative study about the Scandinavian countries' development aid and how it has moved from human rights, idealism-based aid, typically in African context, to being more geopolitically driven, and not least a lot of the aid going to Ukraine. So also highly recommended. At this point, we have about 20 minutes left for Q&A. We will be passing around a microphone, so think of any questions you might have, and if I may invite the panelists to join me on the stage. And yes, great. If you have any question, let us know, and if you could please present yourself with name and any affiliation, and you can direct questions to all the panel or individual panelists. Does anyone want to go first? Everything is clear. Well, I can start then. Oh, we have one? Yes, great.
Since no one else dares. Can you hear what is the microphone out? Okay. So I had a question, sort of something that piqued my interest in the first presentation. And it was around whether or not the Nordic countries had a shared threat perception. I would have thought the threat perception amongst at least the Scandinavian countries were indeed shared, but the way to handle it was different. So Sweden and Finland notoriously have balanced more their dialogue with the major powers in the world rather than sort of join one or the other set of those. And my name is Rikke. I'm from Danish Red Cross.
Yes.
So if you could deep dive a bit into that, that would be interesting.
Yeah, no. It was simply with the broader sort of historical light on. We could sort of go all the way back to pre-World War II. For instance, right? Then the Finns and the Swedes were more afraid of the Russians, and Denmark more afraid of, and Norway more afraid of Germany. But as soon as we get into Cold War territory and beyond, then yes, then it's primarily, you're completely right, it's about how to handle the threat, where we see Finland and Sweden, and to a degree Norway even, preferring a sort of a dual track approach, and well, the Finns are perhaps the best example because you can say, okay, no one doubted which way the Finns pointed their army. The Finns having a large conscript-based army clearly meant to deter Russia, but coupling that strong posture with local cooperation, especially the St. Petersburg area, as whenever they could find some way to cooperate with the Russians, they would do it. And then what we saw was, when we came to 2022, there was this major shift in Finland, and to a little bit of a lesser extent in Sweden. So where in Finland, before 2022, 24% of Finns were in favor of joining NATO. Then after the invasion, 4 months after the invasion, 74% were in favor of joining NATO. So half of every Finn went from being opposed to NATO membership to supporting it. And so there's a radical change in the way they wanted to handle Russia. And that brought them and the Swedes closer to the way that Norwegians and Danes saw on Russia.
Yeah, Rasmus?
Yeah, for my second, I think when it comes to Nordic cooperation, I think it's also been quite interesting that Sweden and Norway has in many years kind of been de facto members, right, because of the partnership agreements with NATO, and there has clearly been, some kind of informal communication, but things have kind of really changed over the last couple of years. And I think what is, at least from my research interest, quite interesting to observe right now is that we are kind of seeing the emergence of kind of the Nordic positions and how Nordic countries are trying to find together in these cooperations. Where I think when it comes to EU stuff, Marlene might say more on this, but we have seen a lot of coordination between the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries in a kind of wider sense, which kind of, and we've also seen it in NATO, where I think this will be quite visible after the NATO summit that we see right now, that has started kind of a regionalization within NATO, simply because the threat perceptions among the different members varies quite a lot. So you have the Southern group, for instance, who is very much focused on migration and don't really see Russia as a threat, whereas you have the Eastern countries, you have the Bucharest 9, but also the Nordic countries who are kind of working more together because they have share the same types of threat perceptions. But these are all things that are kind of emerging, but I think we're starting to see new trends in these two organizations when it comes to these matters, simply because EU is a really big organization, NATO is also growing, and there are a lot of different things that the member state needs to prioritize because we have different types of threats. So I think this is something that we are seeing right now, and I think we'll see more of it in the future, simply because we need this more regional cooperation amongst the different member states.
No, I mean,
it's
not for me.
Another question, yeah. Anyone else? Okay, we'll take 3 questions and then.
Right. My name is Kasper Tonsberg-Sli. I'm from the Democracy in Europe organization, DEU. I'm very curious about these possible alternatives. I can see Sten Rynning is also writing about that we have to sort of put our bets in some emerging group of countries that's not quite clear yet, and we saw like the UK summit, and you see the sort of the picture there where you have a lot of states gathered together: Norway, Canada, Turkey, so all of NATO plus without the US. I heard recently a Danish member of the European Parliament talk about the cooperation between the UK and the Baltic states as a possible venue of closer cooperation in the future. And everyone seems a bit seeking on this, which direction it's going. But is that sort of a promising lead, or how do you see it?
Great question. Then there was yes.
Go to die.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations. My name is Sevi Hadzopoulou and I'm from Roskilde University. And I have a question for Marlene. I think it was very interesting how you discussed the shift that we observe in Denmark now, but I was wondering to what extent this shift that we observe, especially with respect to willingness to invest in defense and collaboration in defense at the EU level, really reflects and represents a real shift in Danish politics and Danish people's view of Europe, or it is part of the new trend and the shift of the EU from geopolitics to geoeconomics.
Thank you. And one last question here.
Thank you. My name is Carsten. I'm from the University of Cambridge. I would like to ask if we see a degree of, let's say, split of Europe of EU into a fast track, more integrationist core, and an outer perimeter, perhaps including some of the more reluctant or divided Eastern Central European countries. Which way would Denmark move?
Lovely. Who would like to start? Mikkel?
Yeah, I can. Is it on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So smaller groupings. Well, let's start with the bigger groupings first, because I think if we sort of take Denmark as a starting point, I think what happened and what Mette Frederiksen was sort of experiencing real time in February, March this year was this realization that we might not be able to count on the US anymore. And that's unfortunate for Denmark because it's actually been the cornerstone of our security policy for 75 years. But we're not alone with that problem. So a lot of people are searching for alternatives these days. And what happens when you're gold security insurance policy turns out to run out, well, then you have to look around for a silver policy or a bronze policy, right? And that's basically what we're doing now. So there's the big policy, there's the sort of the big grouping. We could go with an EU alternative. The advantage with this would be, well, it's a lot of countries. That means a lot of money to spend on defense. It means a lot of people. Downside is, I wonder if we can ever agree on anything, right? So there's that. And similar to this, you could go with European NATO, which is a lot of the same people, with a few exceptions, and the advantage of being able to count on the Canadians as well, possibly. So if this doesn't work, these large groupings, if they turn out to be too complicated, if it turns out to be too complicated to reach an agreement, then you would have to look elsewhere. And this is where the smaller groupings come in. So what do we want from a smaller grouping? Well, the good thing about the Nordics is that the Nordics are very like-minded now. That was my point from the presentation. This could apply to the Baltic countries as well. There is a level of trust and this feeling of not similar size, that they won't run us over and stuff like that. However, there's a problem when it comes to capacity. The Nordics and the Baltics taken together will likely not be able to deter Russia as much as we would like to do. So that sort of opens up for having to involve 1 or 2 or 3 European great powers, that being Germany, France, and the UK as the most, maybe even Poland these days, as the most viable candidates. And then you could say that if we are to have a security alliance, a closer-knit security alliance that we already have with these great powers, then having a bunch of smaller powers that are like-minded and friendly to us included is not a bad thing, because then we're not going to end up alone with the UK or Germany or France. Yes?
Yeah, you want to go, Rasmus?
Yeah, well, just to follow up a little bit on this, also on we mentioned the British Baltic cooperation and things like this. I think we also saw the discussion some years ago that after the Brexit that we needed to find new kind of institutions, so we have to have more flexible arrangements when we want to cooperate. So of course we have the big, as you mentioned, the gold organizations. We have the EU, we have NATO, but they might be quite heavy in some respect and not that flexible. And here there has been an increased interest in various regional organizations like the JEF, the British Joint Expeditionary Force, for instance, as a framework or as a tool to navigate around institutions, but also to bind Britain closer to kind of the European security architecture. I don't know how much power there is in these lines still, but again, it is options that we have, and which I think is quite important. But I think it also, when for smaller states, it also touches upon the broader issues when, if we can't really count on the US, or at least there are some doubts about it, then I think also what we are going to see more in Europe when it comes to small states is the idea about hedging a little bit more, that we are going to spread our risks, or we're going to engage more in different types of organizations. And that is something that kind of small states, I don't think we have been that used to it in European context. We have seen it among smaller states outside Europe quite a lot, which hedging is a kind of a dominant strategy, but it has not been for European small states. So here I think there might also be some changes in the future where I think small states need to be more flexible, I think a little bit out of the box, so that you don't only kind of search for the shadow of the great powers, but also are much more active in order to navigate and find alternatives if kind of the big organization doesn't work, or engage in coalitions within the primary organizations like NATO and EU. I think that will be a wise strategy for small states in the future.
Marlene, there are 2 questions for you.
Yeah, I don't know if I really understood yours, Sylvester. For geopolitics to geoeconomics, can you explain what you mean?
So, for example, even if we see what is happening in the European Union, like with the Draghi report, it's so much about competition and innovation. And if we look also at the Danish priorities of the presidency, you can see, again, very much market-oriented. So to what extent we really see a shift within Denmark towards a more political union, despite the fact that they are engaging so much in defense, I doubt it.
Yeah, very good question. I think that that so far the political side really try not to speak about this too much. So by emphasizing the need to help Ukraine and the fear coming from Russia, and also downplaying the threats from Trump, I think what the politicians are really trying to do is not so much to talk about is it becoming a more political union or is Denmark finally realizing that this project is not just about economics, it's also about politics. I think they go the very pragmatic, down-to-earth route to that, hoping that if we don't talk too much about it, then no one will really notice, and all of a sudden we are in the center, right? Starting to have a big academic debate about what kind of monster are we dealing with, or what kind of political entity. I think that's quite some fear also looking back at the way the EU has been debated previously in previous times. So trying not to be too specific, that's also something we can see with the enlargement discussions, that we say we want Ukraine in, but we don't want to talk about so who is going to pay, you know, and what kind of union will it be with 40 million Ukrainians and maybe the Balkans as well. So I think that in light of the enormously difficult road to Europe in Denmark, where it really has been very, very cumbersome and hard to be visionary, and it always had to be about pragmatics. What do we get out of it? What's in it for me? It constantly had to be this pragmatic approach. I think that the politicians are continuing that. I don't think we are. Apart from Mette Frederiksen's speech about Mozart and Bach and who else in the parliament, I think that the Danes and the Danish politicians, they are really trying to to keep their feet on the ground and trying to make things evolve and make those things that do evolve make sense to people in a very pragmatic way, so that nobody talks about the elephant in the room, right? The elephant in the room is, of course, federalism. Let's face it, you know. How can you develop in a more political direction, talking about a geopolitical, strategic Europe, without also saying, okay, if we are moving towards a hard shell Europe, right? With firm borders, but also with action capacity to step up at the international level and at the international scene, then we are moving in that direction. And of course, then there are a lot of issues about moving from unanimity to qualified majority voting and all that. But that's details. It's more, I think, mentally that we need to move this super tanker from being a purely intergovernmental project to be more than that. And there, I think there's a difference between NATO and the EU, because NATO has always been intergovernmental. So it's much easier for Denmark to navigate in NATO than in the EU, where EU law is binding, where the court can set aside what Parliament has decided. Yesterday we even talked about taking Denmark to court for not having made sure that our waters are clean. We have not living up to the EU directives on not polluting our own waters. But this is really fundamentally and qualitatively a completely different project. And I think that that's also why I conclude that it's in reality, a very defense-oriented move to Europe we are seeing. The other part is still I think, halting. And it's still something that the politicians really try to, not to talk too much about. The other question, do you remember, Jessica, what it was about?
Yes, it was about EU integration, and if there was a split in a fast track and another fast track, where would Denmark be?
And I think that we have discussed variable geometry for years and years and years. I remember having written about this 25 years ago, and then I met Bjarne Corydon in Deadline, and he talked about it all the time, and I said, well, didn't you read all the, millions of books already? But he thought it was a new concept. I could tell him it wasn't a new concept. So we have always been discussing this, and just as a footnote, the opt-outs that Denmark acquired back in the day was actually the first time a member state was allowed to have opt-outs that were not temporary. So we were actually the ones introducing variable geometry. We were the ones acquiring the right to be in the union, but at the same time not be in the first division, right? So when you ask, will the EU develop into several kind of realms or tempi or clubs even, I think that what we will see with the enlargement, and I think geopolitics is increasingly taking over the merit-based, even though politicians are not allowed to admit that. But I think the reality on the ground is that for geopolitical reasons, we need Ukraine in the EU, and then we have to handle it as we go along. So in that respect, and if that happens in the next 10 to 15 years, then I think we will see an integration of a new big country into the Union that is going to be much more selective. So, I mean, they will join certain sectors of cooperation and others will have to wait. So I think that geopolitics is going to determine also the enlargement process. And will Denmark then be in the center in the future? That's a very, very good and interesting question. And I actually, at this point, I'm not a big optimist if that is a good thing. If you don't like Denmark to be in the center, then of course that's not a good thing. But if we assume that being closer to the core is a good thing, then I think it will take many more years. You can see that the political level certainly do not want to talk about joining the euro. They also don't want to take another referendum on justice and home affairs. So, altså brændt barn skyer ilden. What is it called in English? I don't know. But the whole question about referenda is so. We have been so wounded in many ways in Denmark, confronting the people, that I don't think you have politicians out there, except from a few, who actually think that Denmark should have referendums on these two topics. And that's also why I think that the move to Europe that we are facing right now is primarily driven by the fear of being left on the perron, hvad hedder det? Platform by the Americans and of course in a much more dangerous political situation with Putin on the one side, and then a reluctant America that is no longer really. You cannot be sure that they will be there for us.
Let's see. This concludes. We can just one more question. Just wait for the microphone, if you will.
Thank you very much. I'm Norma Pensada. I'm the ambassador of Mexico here in Denmark. And thank you for the presentations. It's been really very interesting. And as a foreigner, I'm learning a lot about Denmark, and you help me a lot. Just one question. I'm very curious because we are talking about Danish foreign policy. But so far, and the book and presentation has, of course, for natural reasons, is very much concentrated as a foreign policy towards Europe. I would be very interested in learning your takes about the foreign policy of Denmark towards the rest of the world. I remember when the new strategy of security and foreign policy in 2023 was launched in May. I was really very struck by that the fact not only the Middle East was just mentioned one, but Latin America was not even mentioned at all in the strategy. So we were really very surprised for that. But in fact, some of the mentionings in this strategy from 2023 was talking about the needs for Denmark to review its partnerships with the rest of the world, building new partnerships, diversifying the critical dependencies, building new bridges, strengthening the role of the EU as a global partner in the world, and so on. But so far, we have been, I guess, and of course I understand for very natural reasons, a lot of concentration towards inside Europe. Now the new geopolitics obliges all of us to look wider. So what could you think could be the new approach of, I understand that the new strategy is being written. I don't know when will be released, but what would be your takes about this new foreign policy strategy?
Excellent. So a final piece of advice to the policymakers, and you have 1 minute each. Mikkel, you look like you want to start.
Yes. Very good question. Quick question about the entire rest of the world. We'll try to do it in 1 minute. No, Denmark is a trading nation. Denmark has traditionally been very active when it comes to climate change. Denmark has often had a very active UN policy. So, of course, all these things still matter. It also should be said that our panel, well, we didn't get a representative from the people that wrote the developmental policy chapter. They would also have expanded our geography focus a bit. However, I think we must also be honest that when I look at Danish foreign and security policy, even developmental policy, if we read what they write, right? A lot of the developmental aid goes to Ukraine now. There is a tendency that Denmark is shifting its gaze home. Maybe not to Denmark only, but to Denmark's near abroad. And that is because security politics is increasingly taking primacy. And that's what we're seeing. So it's not that Denmark doesn't care about the rest of the world. I really think we still do. It's just that as a small country with limited resources, the security in the near abroad comes first.
Nice and short. Yeah, Rasmus?
I can only second that. I think we haven't forgot about the world, but I think as Mikkel said, due to this kind of change that we see right now, there will be a strict Danish focus on the Baltic Sea region, the EU, Ukraine, and of course also the Arctic, Greenland question will be very much the center of attention, at least from my perspective. But we have also seen kind of a Danish interest in Africa primarily because there has been a lot of development there. But as I see it, when it comes to the rest of the world, so to speak, I think there's very much a multilateralism, meaning that we act through EU, we act through the UN. So that's not a strong element in the bilateral Danish foreign policy, but it's a part of kind of the Danish approach to EU and UN, etc. But I also agree that what we have seen the last couple of years is that so much is going on security matters now that it kind of tightened our focus a little bit more on the regional dynamics.
Marlene, 1 minute.
It was not really, I think, for me, but I think I would like to add something to that. That I think that actually, when you look at the EU, and I think the EU is the one taking over trade relations. It has been trade, for many years, been the one negotiating trade deals with the rest of the world from representing everyone in the union. I think the focus is actually quite a lot to say we want to trade with everyone. We do not want to accept that just because Americans are putting tariffs, then we will do the same. Or so von der Leyen, who represents Denmark, has actually been reaching out to South America, Mercosur. I think that we are going to see in the future many more deals being made with regions and countries that go beyond the US, if Trump continues with his very aggressive trade policy. So don't take us three as a representative of not wanting to reach out to the world. I certainly think we will, but it's just Denmark is a very small player in this, so it will be the EU who represents us to a large extent, at least when it comes to trade.
Denmark and the EU will reach out to the world. I think that's a very happy note to end this seminar on. So thank you very much for your questions. Thanks for coming. Thank you to the panelists. There's cake and bubbles waiting, but let's give the panelists a big hand.